As they marched on Moscow, it seemed as if the entire world hung in the balance. After years spent as Vladimir Putin's shadow hand around the world, after months and months distinguishing themselves as the most brutal and bloodthirsty combatants of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Wagner Group had set its sights on Russia itself, and there was no guarantee that they could be stopped. In the months since, the world might have felt as if they watched the collapse of a rising empire nearly as quickly as they'd seen it rise from nothing. The first advance on Moscow was brought to a decisive end. Then, after months of questions and speculation, their leaders were sent plummeting from the sky in a trail of ash and fire. Their command was dismantled, their soldiers were scattered to the wind, and it seemed as if the Wagner Group was gone for good. But now the sun rises on a new era for what's left of the Wagner Group. Scattered to the wind, certainly, and with as much of its future still as unclear as ever. But now, one thing is for certain: Wagner is not dead, it's evolving. Cut one head from the Hydra, and two more take its place. And on today's special episode of Warographics, we're going to be exploring where the Wagner Group has ended up, and what that means for the future of the world's most beleaguered superpower. Meet Anton Yelizarov. Born in 1981 in the Rostov Oblast of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, Yelizarov has been a part of a military for all of his adult life. By the time he was 18, he graduated from military school. By the time he was 23, he'd become commander of an airborne platoon. After more than a decade of service to modern-day Mother Russia, Yelizarov was booted from the ranks of the Russian military on charges of crimes against property. But that wasn't the end of him. From Russia's military proper, he joined a rising underground force in his nation, the nascent Wagner Group, then just getting its start under its military commander Dmitry Utkin and its public sponsor, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Under their command, Yelizarov served in Syria, trained troops in the Central African Republic, commanded elite stormtrooper units in Libya, and led the assault on the Ukrainian city of Soledar and the now ravaged town of Bakhmut. For his work, he earned the title of Hero of the Russian Federation, and another distinction he prized perhaps even more dearly, his call sign, Lotus. After the Wagner Group got its world rocked in August of 2023 with the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin and Dmitry Utkin in a fiery plane crash, it was Lotus who was suspected to have assumed command of the organization. For their part, the remnants of Wagner denied that claim, perhaps because it was false, or perhaps because it served Yelizarov more to lead from the shadows, especially after the fate that had befallen the organization's last publicly known commanders. But according to Wagner sources, Yelizarov had indeed taken over both the role of Wagner's top commander in combat and its lead position in training. Who he might answer to, then as now, remains unclear, but he is the highest known authority among Wagner today. So when Yelizarov went missing, speculation rightly ran wild. For days after Russian sources first noted his disappearance, it was unclear just what, if anything, had happened to him. Perhaps he'd fallen out of favor with Putin, perhaps it shipped off to command Wagner forces directly in some quiet backwater conflict somewhere, or perhaps he was already dead, knocked off by the next ambitious Wagner leader who thought he deserved a crack at the top job. Regardless, it would be almost impossible to catch sight of him in the future if he didn't want to be found, and instead chose to, or had to disappear into the darkest corners of Russia's paramilitary scene. But as it turned out, the real answer was actually none of the above. In early February of 2024, Yelizarov did the one thing nobody expected. He got on camera for the first time since the deaths of Prigozhin and Utkin and cut a promo so revealing that we might as well just read you the English translation. We continue to work. We continue to work on the African continent, and we continue to work in Belarus. For the good of Russia, we are working successfully. I am located at the group's headquarters in Cossack camps. We are building a camp so that new units that will be formed, which will become part of the volunteer corps of Russia's National Guard, can arrive and settle. The camp continues to grow and be built. We are moving towards our goal. Places for accommodation and meals are ready for arrivals. I want to say to the people of the Russian Federation, we have always defended, are defending, and will defend the people of the Russian Federation and the interests of the Russian Federation, and we will do this anywhere in the world. We are moving towards our goals with big steps and with our head held high. Now, obviously, there's a lot to unpack there, but we read Yelizarov's statement directly because it provides the clearest look by far that we've gotten into the current state of the Wagner Group since the group's attempted mutiny took place. Yelizarov's admission that Wagner has continued its work both in Africa and Belarus isn't necessarily a surprise, but with those groups in Africa now operating largely on their own, and rest assured we're going to be talking about them separately in a moment, it's telling that Yelizarov still seems to consider Wagner's African detachments as part of the same command structure. But even more important is the confirmation of what Western intelligence has suspected for months, that Wagner was on its way back to operations in Russia and possibly even in Ukraine under a new banner. Yelizarov explained that his training camp, apparently under the name of Cossack Camps in reference to the fiercely independent and military elite Cossacks of Russia's past, would be sending volunteers to fight alongside Russia's National Guard. Wagner itself is believed to have begun the process of absorbing itself into the National Guard, known as the Rosgvardia. The decision to incorporate Wagner into Rosgvardia is a move that allows both the group's fighters to continue fighting in Russia's interest, and it should, in theory, allay Moscow's fears that Wagner might one day repeat the affairs of July and August 2023. By making Wagner directly subsidiary to Rosgvardia, Putin ensures that there will be no Prigozhin-style uprising without a whole lot of very obvious organizational changes preceding it. He also allows Wagner fighters to continue their work without subordinating themselves to the Russian Ministry of Defense or MOD directly. Rosgvardia is, at least on paper, separate from the Russian armed forces and reports directly to Vladimir Putin himself. That separation from the MOD matters a whole lot because Wagner and the MOD have some serious beef. Finally, the move ensures that Russia will continue to benefit from Wagner's combat prowess as its experienced troops are in high demand on the front lines in Ukraine, and its mass numbers of prison convicts are a lot easier for Moscow to use if the actual Russian government isn't the one having to recruit and train them. According to British intelligence, 3 former Wagner assault units will now be integrated into the 1st Volunteer Corps unit, be they a regiment, a brigade, or whatever else, that Yelizarov and his forces are apparently going to train. Thus, these Wagner fighters are copy-pasted directly into Rosgvardia's volunteer units and sent back to the front lines in Ukraine, where they're so desperately needed. Some of those fighters and their fellow volunteers will also be headed to Africa for contract periods of 9 months on the African continent versus 6 months in Ukraine. Just as interesting as Wagner's new place in the Russian military architecture is the physical place where these Cossack camps appear to be set up. Not in Belarus, where Wagner was banished for a time after Prigozhin's failed mutiny, but in Russia itself. Specifically, they're believed to be in the region or oblast of Rostov, in a facility shared with or next to the barracks of Russia's 150th Motor Rifle Division. Wagner is believed to be popular in Rostov Oblast, where locals appeared on video cheering and taking pictures with Wagner troops in the regional capital, Rostov-on-Don, as the Wagner troops passed through on their way towards Moscow. The decision to allow Wagner to set up a base in Russia, let alone in Rostov specifically, should indicate at least some confidence on Russia's part that Wagner and Yelizarov are now firmly under Russian control and are considered safe enough to be welcomed back into Russia in force. And the decision to incorporate Wagner into Rosgvardia also raises the importance of Vladimir Putin's recent decision to equip Rosgvardia with heavier weaponry than they previously had. That decision was made in the wake of Wagner's march on Moscow, when Rosgvardia proved unable or unwilling to intervene and try and slow them down, a choice that has since been explained to Putin as a result of the fact that Rosgvardia didn't have the armored vehicles or the other equipment it needed to go toe-to-toe with the mercenaries. Now the mercenaries are on track to come into possession of much of the same equipment, as well as the other perks of full acceptance into the above-board Russian defense apparatus. But the re-emergence of Anton Yelizarov is not the only notable piece of Wagner news to emerge in the last few weeks. As the Cossack Camp sets itself up in Rostov, a new force appears to be rising several thousand kilometers away: the Afrika Korps. If the name sounds familiar, it's no accident. The German Afrika Korps were an elite Nazi desert warfare force under the command of Erwin Rommel, and this new Russian organization appears to have adopted that same title. Unlike the Nazi army of old, today's Afrika Korps are firmly under the command of Vladimir Putin, and they're actively recruiting in hopes of spreading Russian influence across the continent. Now, traditionally, operations in Africa have been considered pretty firmly as the Wagner Group's domain. Because the mercenary force was technically not part of the Russian military, they gave Russia quite a bit of plausible deniability for their operations in the region, even though Wagner was there on Russia's orders, protecting Russia's interests. Among those interests are oil fields, mines for precious metals and gems, and friendly ruling regimes in a range of African nations, all of which Russia wants to protect, but none of which Russia wants to be outright responsible for. In the wake of Wagner's march on Moscow, significant portions of Wagner have been punished or even booted out of Russia, but the group's African contingents have kept up their work, leading some experts to speculate on whether they were really part of a cohesive Wagner group or had become local warlords paying tribute to Moscow. The arrival of the Afrika Korps changes that calculus in a big way. The name is only semi-official, but the paramilitary organization itself is a creation of the Russian Ministry of Defense, and while it is still technically a paramilitary operation, it's much more clearly under Russia's command than Wagner ever was. Like Russia's decision to sublimate Wagner to Rosgvardia in Russia, Putin appears willing to make the trade-off between less plausible deniability and more confidence that there won't be a repeat of the sort of incident Russia got from Wagner in 2023. Instead, the Afrika Korps appears to be taking direct control of Wagner's operations in Mali, Libya, Burkina Faso, and at least to an extent, the Central African Republic. The former Wagner employees there have been given the option to join the Afrika Korps or quit, and they're free to wear their Wagner insignia, keep their internal traditions, and fight in the same units under the same commanders as they'd done before. As for what Wagner was doing in each of those countries, it depends on where you're talking about. In Burkina Faso, a force of about 100 fighters, set to rise to around 300 soon, is setting up shop with the intent of safeguarding the country's ruling military junta. In Libya, they've committed war crimes and served on the front lines in service to warlord Khalifa Haftar, who, despite not technically being at war with the Libyan government right at this very moment, nonetheless maintains one side of a low-grade conflict that hasn't really stopped since the end of Libya's second civil war. In Mali, Wagner has been working overtime to support a ruling military junta against insurgents in the Sahel region, and the group is suspected to have been involved with some highly questionable activities there, including a mass summary execution of Malians just weeks before this episode was written. And in the Central African Republic, they prop up the regime of President Faustin Archange Touadéra and maintain a strong military presence watching over gold mines and extracting precious metals via mining companies that they own or control. With each of these subgroups now coming under the command of the Afrika Korps, it's likely that Russia's presence on the continent isn't going away anytime soon, and that in fact, Russia may be willing to drop some of its secrecy and illusion around its support of authoritarian and often violent leaders there. While the Wagner forces in the Central African Republic may prove difficult to control on account of their size and wealth, the others appear to be falling in line rather neatly. And with a sustained, strategically organized Russian presence there, Africa has no shortage of countries that might want an Afrika Korps detachment of their own. Alongside Mali and Burkina Faso, the nations of Guinea, Niger, and Gabon are each ruled by military junta after a series of recent coups, and like Mali and Burkina Faso, these coup leaders might be willing to pay extra for their own protection. The Democratic Republic of the Congo's leader, Felix Tshisekedi, is believed to be shopping around for a potential partnership with Wagner. Chad's leader, Mahamat Déby, has had recent meetings with Vladimir Putin and subsequently promised that, quote, many things will change. And several other nations on the continent are actively engaged in war or dealing with violent insurgencies that the Afrika Korps could help to suppress. In examining the strange, nebulous evolutions of the Wagner Group as they exist right now, it's important to point out that there's just as much we still don't know as what we do. What will be the fate of Wagner's troops in Belarus? To remain independent, to become contractors or even part of the Belarusian military, or to join Russia's forces either in Rosgvardia or somewhere else? What about the group believed to be under the command of Andrei Troshev, already fighting in Ukraine? What are they? And what will be the actual work of the Wagner fighters in the new Cossack camps? Are they just there to give established Wagner mercenaries new uniform patches and send them back into combat? Or if they train new Wagner starfighters en masse, will they be elite models of what Wagner veterans have been in the past, or just another group of conscripts in an overwhelmingly conscripted army? If one thing's for sure, it's that the Wagner Group will not be stepping out of Russia's global military infrastructure anytime soon. Although the rise of the new Afrika Korps is a change in name and organization for the former Wagner detachments there, the Afrika Korps is only a somewhat altered version of the same overall strategic vision. Wagner, whether it's still called Wagner or not, will remain active in protecting Russian interests abroad and propping up the few real allies that Russia still has left. Just as important is the news that Wagner will now be operating large-scale training camps in Russia again, and this time with the backing, support, and authority of Rosgvardia. For basically all of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Wagner's elite fighters have been among the best on the battlefield, and their apparent lack of hesitation to engage in all manner of crimes against humanity have granted them a fearsome reputation in the eyes of combatants from both sides. Now, with Russia's military having apparently lost a sizable proportion of the experienced soldiers it had before the war, Russia proper relies largely on conscripts to do its work, and any information that these conscripts have beyond just the basics are picked up desperately and with little proper instruction as they try to survive on the battlefield. Wagner, by contrast, appears to take quite a bit more time getting its recruits into fighting shape, and now Russia is putting that training capability to work in service to Russia's own interests. Then there's the implications of the Wagner return to the battlefields of Ukraine. As we speak, those battlefields are frozen not just by the bitter post-Soviet winter, but by a long stalemate that's seen Ukraine unable to make much forward progress. The work that Ukraine did to slowly grind its way eastward, digging up ungodly numbers of landmines in the process, will likely have to repeat again, and that's if Ukraine can keep what little initiative it has left. With Western financial support and arms shipments drying up, F-16s and main battle tanks far from the front lines, and morale dipping lower and lower on the home front, Ukraine may be forced to pivot toward a long defense sooner than later. That's a defense that could probably hold out against the Russian forces it currently faces, but that story could be rewritten very quickly if experienced and highly knowledgeable ex-Wagner fighters begin to show up again in large numbers. And lastly, we've got to acknowledge the potential, however long it would take to be realized, that Wagner could turn back toward Russia and begin its own takeover in Rosgvardia. Of course, even attempting such a thing would require a leader with Yevgeny Prigozhin's or Dmitry Utkin's ambitions and conviction that their way to lead is the only way to lead. Whether Yelizarov and his deputies have that ambition, we don't know. It would also be extremely risky, as Putin, current leaders within Rosgvardia, and the rest of the Russian military would likely notice a Wagner leader climbing to the top and start ringing the alarm bells. But with Wagner now incorporated into the ranks of Rosgvardia, a national guard with hundreds of thousands of soldiers and more power, influence, and resources than Wagner ever had, the path still exists for Rosgvardia to consume Wagner, only to be consumed by it a few years, or even a couple of decades down the road. In the short but complex history of the Wagner Group, the organization's next moves have never truly been clear, but now it appears that the remnants of Wagner are headed back toward the front lines across the globe. When they arrive, they'll bring to bear the same ruthless, destructive, and utterly soulless violence that's become a hallmark of their operations, and the people forced to stand against them will have to hold back a hydra that simply won't stop growing new heads.